In round one, for the civil rights region, we have Brown versus Board of Education versus the Regents of University of California versus Bakke. One of the most famous cases in the court's history, Brown overruled Plessy versus Ferguson, which declared separate but equal unconstitutional. It is perhaps the single greatest accomplishment of the court. Easy win against Bakke's case of affirmative action, which was upheld.
And now for the Constitution region. Dred Scott v. Stanford vs. New York Times vs. United States. This matchup especially highlights that we aren't trying to find the best decision ever made by the court, but rather the most monumental. It's for that reason that Dred Scott, which held that African Americans, both slave and free, could not be citizens of the United States and therefore could not bring suit in federal court. New York Times gave us the principle that the government must meet an incredibly high burden in order to put prior restraints on journalistic publications. Important in its own right, but it is often argued that Dred Scott is one of the reasons for the Civil War. That's pretty monumental.
Now onto the Sweet 16. We'll start with the civil rights region.
First we have Brown v. Board versus Plessy v. Ferguson. I certainly did not see Brown v. Board of Education coming up against the case it overturned for a place in the final. So what we're left with is a decision about whether the 60 years through which the country ensured the separate but equal had more of an effect on the nation than the time since it was overturned. While African Americans are still facing struggles due to the hindrance of their advancement in society during the first half of this century, great strides has been made and continue to be made because of the legal revolution started by Brown. That's why this one has a clear winner in my mind.
Now on to Griswold v. Connecticut versus Mapp versus Ohio. Griswold got to this point on the weight the decision has held in deciding a number of other notable cases. Justice Kennedy described the right to privacy found in Griswold as the most pertinent beginning point, and the evolution of the concepts embodied versus Lawrence v. Texas. Griswold is also an incredibly notable decision due to its resilience on an enumerated right, the right to privacy. The implications of finding fundamental rights outside of the express language of the Constitution is a concept with seemingly limitless consequences. When framed correctly, Mapp just doesn't stand a chance.
In the Constitution region for McCulloch versus Maryland versus Dred Scott v. Stanford, McCulloch shows the reach of the Supremacy Clause, as in Congress has ultimate power. While Dred Scott was completely wrong in reasoning, it doesn't mean its impact wasn't massive. Under Articles 3 and 4, Dred Scott was clearly overturned. McCulloch takes the win on this one.
And for the political process region, Korematsu v. U.S. versus Baker v. Carr. Korematsu is commonly viewed as one of the biggest mistakes ever made by the Supreme Court, and rightfully so. It approved the practice of interning Japanese Americans during World War II, and presents a low point in the Supreme Court jurisprudence. In Baker v. Carr, the court set aside the political question doctrine that ruled it can decide a voting rights question. Baker v. Carr was first important voting rights case and defeats Korematsu v. U.S.
In Texas v. Johnson, the majority of the court, according to Justice William Brennan, agreed with Johnson and held that flag burning constitutes a form of symbolic speech that is protected by the First Amendment. The majority noted that freedom of speech protects actions that society may find very offensive, but society's outrage alone is not justification for suppressing free speech. Miranda, however, addresses how the Fifth Amendment requires that law enforcement officials advise suspects of their right to remain silent and to obtain an attorney during interrogations while in police custody. Miranda still protects the rights of the accused today and trumps Texas in this round.
Elite 8, Civil Rights Region, Brown v. Board of Education versus Griswold versus Connecticut. Brown v. Board of Education was a monumental case that helped fight segregation and made education a right for not only just white students in America, but all students. In Griswold versus Connecticut, we see the importance of how the Constitution is a living document that changes throughout the times. It can serve almost unlimited purposes and helps people understand and interpret their constitutional rights. It's safe to say that the decision has had a profound effect on politics and the debate about morality in this country, but Brown versus Board takes the win on this one.
And now for the Bill of Rights region. We have Gideon v. Wainwright versus Miranda v. Arizona. Gideon is a landmark decision in which the court held that the 14th Amendment requires state courts to provide counsel in criminal cases to represent defendants who are unable to pay for their own attorney. It extended the rights explicitly set forward in the 5th and 6th Amendments at the federal level. Miranda may be one of the best-known Supreme Courts to law persons, and its impact is obvious. It was the case that established the reading of the Miranda rights as part of routine police procedures. Because of its widely known legacy, Miranda wins this matchup.
Now for political process region, Baker v. Carr versus Citizens United v. FEC. Baker v. Carr established the right of federal courts to review redistricting issues. The court's willingness to address legislative reappointment in this Tennessee case paved the way for the one man, one vote. Citizens United is a landmark U.S. constitutional law, campaign finance, and corporate law dealing with regulation of political campaign spending by organizations.
This is Sarah Duart reporting live from the University of Notre Dame. For our Final Four matchup, we have Marbury versus Madison versus Miranda versus Arizona. As we've seen previously in our recent matchups, Marbury versus Madison has held up really well. As we know, Marbury set the stage for what would become the foundation of judicial review in our country, and nevertheless, it's safe to say that the U.S. government would not operate in the same manner as it does if it weren't for the decision in this court case. The Miranda case is a significant Supreme Court case because it ruled that a defendant's statements to authority are inadmissible in a court unless the defendant has been informed of their rights. So few events have altered the course of American jurisprudence more than the Miranda case, which justifies its high stare decisis value. But in the end, Marbury versus Madison will come out on top because of its conflicting views on judicial review even today. Our other Final Four matchup is Citizens United versus FEC versus Brown versus Board of Education. So in Citizens United, we know that this lowered the final barriers on limiting the flow of corporate money into elections and politics. Brown versus Board of Education we see as a huge landmark case in the Supreme Court because it declared state laws establishing separate public schools for blacks and white students to be unconstitutional. This case overruled the previous Supreme Court case of Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, which allowed state-sponsored segregation. So because this case still affects us today, and schools are still segregated as we see, this case takes the cake, and Brown versus Board of Education will be going into the final two.
And the winner is Brown v. Board of Education. Brown is a beacon of light that helped establish racial equality. Essentially, Brown stands for the proposition that the government stands for all people, not just one group. And when all the people are not being treated with equality, reason isn't needed to support a just conclusion. It simply exists.